The gavel had barely fallen silent when Judge Stephen Breyer leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a grin that spread wider than the silence deserved. Then came the sound, low at first, then louder, richer, rolling out like thunder. He believed he owned a laugh. The kind of laugh that wasn't just amusement, but dismissal. A laugh meant to reduce the words of Jasmine Crockett into something trivial, something not worth the weight of the chamber. The courtroom caught the cue, and soon, scattered chuckles filled the air like sparks off a fire. Eager to please the man they saw as untouchable, the narrator's voice pierced through. The courtroom roared with laughter. But within seconds, everything would turn to ice. Crockett sat still at first, her eyes locked forward, unflinching, as if the laughter weren't aimed at her, but at the millions she carried with her, voices of the unheard, the underestimated, the uninvited. The smirk on Breyer's face grew as he leaned just a little further back. Basking in the ripple of control, his laugh had unleashed. But what the room didn't see? What they couldn't yet recognize was the storm building inside the silence of Crockett's pause. Silence sharper than words, colder than any retort. It was in the narrowing of her gaze, the faint arch of her brow, the stillness of someone who knows she's about to strike not with volume, but with precision. Audience members began to notice the shift. The chuckles that had felt safe only moments ago now began to falter, dangling awkwardly in the air. Even the court stenographer's fingers hesitated above the keys, sensing that something unrepeatable was about to unfold. Breyer, still grinning, didn't realize it. To him, this was another moment of superiority, another chance to show the room and the world that experience and stature were unshakable. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the sharpest eyes, and so the stage was set. A man laughing. From the comfort of power, and a woman gathering her fire in silence, the contrast stretched like a bowstring seconds from release. She leaned forward, lips parting, ready to speak words that would not only stop the laughter but freeze it in place. What came next would leave the entire chamber breathless. Why did that laugh sting so deeply? Because it wasn't just about one line, one exchange, or even one courtroom moment. It was about history. It was about who gets taken seriously in America and who gets reduced to a punchline. When Stephen Breyer, a man who once carried the weight of the Supreme Court on his shoulders, leaned back and laughed. It wasn't merely a personal dismissal of Jasmine Crockett. It was the echo of generations of voices telling women, telling immigrants, telling communities of color, you don't belong in this space. The room felt that weight, even if they couldn't name it. The polished wood of the benches seemed to carry the vibration of that laughter, bouncing it back into the ears of everyone listening. Some smirked along, nodding in complicity. Others froze, uncomfortable, torn between deference to an elder statesman and the gnawing recognition that something about this scene was profoundly wrong. Breyer had power not the kind measured in votes anymore, but the symbolic weight of having been there, having ruled, having shaped precedent. His laugh carried the confidence of a man who thought his words still defined the boundaries of serious debate. To him, Crockett was just a younger politician trying to stake her claim in a world that had already been written by men like him. But here's where the stakes rise. Crockett was not simply speaking for herself. She had walked into that chamber carrying entire communities on her shoulders, people who had heard laughter like Breyer's all their lives, immigrants whose accents had been mocked, young professionals told their ideas were cute but unrealistic, women interrupted, brushed aside, told to wait their turn while the powerful laughed. For those people, Crockett's composure in the face of that dismissal wasn't just personal pride. It was survival, and survival has a way of sharpening the voice into something unstoppable. This moment wasn't about legal technicalities or political theater. It was about America itself. An America deciding whether its future belonged only to those who had ruled it for decades, or to those who dared to challenge the laughter of that establishment. The air in the chamber grew taut. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing they weren't just witnessing another exchange of words, but a turning point in tone, in symbolism, in respect. The smirk on Breyer's face seemed suddenly fragile, even if he didn't realize it yet. And Crockett. She was preparing to prove that laughter could be shattered. that dignity could be reclaimed, that even the grandest voice of the old guard could be silenced not by shouting, but by truth delivered at the perfect moment. Because what came next would not just answer a laugh. It would change the way this courtroom and the country beyond it remembered this day. To understand the weight of that laugh, you have to understand the man behind it. Stephen Breyer, former Supreme Court Justice. For nearly 3 decades, he sat at the pinnacle of American law, cloaked in black robes, his words shaping the rules by which the nation lived. He was known for his sharp intellect, his long-winded hypotheticals, and his confidence in the power of reason. To some, he was a steady hand in turbulent times. But to others, especially to those who lived outside the comfort of privilege he represented, something else. The establishment's quiet arrogance, the belief that wisdom belonged only to the old, the white, the powerful. Breyer had built a career on words, complex, layered academic words. He was the man who could turn a courtroom into a classroom, who could reduce arguments to puzzles only he could solve. Admirers called him brilliant. Critics called him detached. But what both sides agreed on was this: Stephen Breyer carried himself like someone who could not be challenged. And in many rooms he couldn't. That was the thing about power. Once you've worn it for long enough, it doesn't vanish when you step down. It lingers in the way people address you, in the deference they give your opinions, in the assumption that you know better simply because you always have. Breyer didn't need the robe anymore, carried the aura of authority wherever he went. And that laugh, that dismissive burst aimed at Jasmine Crockett, wasn't just about her. It was about maintaining that aura, reminding everyone that the old guard still sat in the highest chair, even when no longer officially on the bench. But arrogance has blind spots. Breyer had spent years surrounded by clerks and colleagues who treated his words like gospel. He lived in circles where laughter at the inexperienced or the radical was seen as intellectual sport. He was used to people waiting for his nod before daring to disagree. That laugh came not from cruelty, perhaps, but from habit, from a lifetime of assuming his perspective was the final word. Yet habit does not excuse impact, and here is the contradiction at the core of Breyer's legacy. The man who often spoke about the importance of democracy, inclusion, and civic trust was, in moments like these, the same man who revealed the quiet elitism that so many Americans felt excluded by. The laugh was more than a sound. It was a symbol. It was the establishment telling the next generation, "We don't take you seriously." In that courtroom, Breyer became more than just a retired judge. He became the living embodiment of the wall so many young, diverse leaders spend their lives pushing against. The wall of tradition, the wall of hierarchy, the wall of being told in ways subtle and loud that they hadn't earned their place. His smirk, his chuckle, his smug tilt of the head, all of it became the face of the barrier Jasmine Crockett was determined to break. And the irony. Breyer himself probably believed he was untouchable in that moment. He had lived too long above the fray to imagine that someone could turn his own laughter into a weapon against him. He believed the room was his, that the audience would side with him, that history itself was on his side. What he didn't see was the way the world had shifted while he wasn't looking. The America he laughed in wasn't the America that had first seated him on the court. This was an America that was tired of being told to wait, tired of being laughed at, tired of being dismissed. That was his flaw, underestimating not just Jasmine Crockett, but everyone who saw themselves in her. And in that flaw lay the seed of downfall, because arrogance may win the laugh, wins the silence that follows. Silence, in the right hands, can be deadlier than any sound. Crockett was about to prove that. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in that chamber by accident, nor by favor. She arrived through a path carved with grit, long nights, and the relentless belief that voices like hers, too often silenced, deserved to be heard. To understand why she sat there, unflinching beneath Breyer's laughter, you have to return to where it began. Crockett's story is stitched together by contrasts, the humble beginnings and the grand halls of power, the quiet sacrifices of family, and the roaring demands of public life. She grew up in a world where dignity was not handed to you, where respect was not assumed. It had to be earned, fought for, protected. So from her earliest days, she learned that to be heard, you had to speak with clarity. To be respected, you had to refuse to shrink. Law was her weapon of choice. While others saw the courtroom as a place of intimidation, she saw it as a battlefield where truth could still rise above prejudice. She studied not just to master the statutes and precedents, but to master the art of standing firm when those statutes were used to exclude. Nights spent bent over case law. Mornings spent preparing for arguments no one expected her to win. This was her training ground. Every dismissal she encountered became another spark in the fire of determination. When she entered politics, she carried that same fire. The politics demanded something even more ruthless than the law: resilience in the face of ridicule. In Congress, in committees, in interviews, she was often underestimated, often spoken over. She knew what it meant to be told. She was too loud, too emotional, too radical. And she knew what it meant when colleagues who did not look like her were praised for the same passion she was scolded for. Yet Crockett refused to fold. Instead, she leaned into her identity, wearing it not as a burden, but as armor. She spoke openly about her roots, about the struggles of her constituents, about the communities whose stories were often erased. Many she became not just a politician, but a symbol of persistence, of identity, of the audacity to stand tall in rooms built to make her feel small. And here's what made her so dangerous to someone like Breyer. She knew his type. She had faced his laugh before in countless disguises. Professors who chuckled at her idealism, colleagues who rolled their eyes at her insistence on fairness, commentators who treated her rise as a novelty act rather than the result of skill. She had been laughed at, underestimated, sidelined each time. She had sharpened her voice into a blade. This is what the room didn't yet see as Breyer leaned back in condescension. Crockett wasn't shaken. She was preparing. Every pause, every breath, every beat of silence was her drawing the bowstring tighter. The laugh that was meant to belittle her only reminded her why she fought. Because Crockett didn't just speak. For herself, she carried the weight of 1,000 stories. The immigrant child whose accent was mocked in class. The working mother dismissed as unprofessional because of her exhaustion. The young lawyer who watched her arguments waved away until a man repeated them. She carried them all into that room, into that moment, into that silence after Breyer's chuckle. Her backstory wasn't a tale of privilege. It was a tale of perseverance. Every step she had taken had trained her for this, to look a man with decades of authority in his eyes and refuse to flinch, to remind a man the country that respect is not granted by age or robe, but by truth. And so, while Breyer laughed, Crockett waited. She let him enjoy his moment of superiority because she knew something he did not. Laughter fades. It always does. And when it does, the silence that follows can be filled with words that last forever. Her story had prepared her to seize that silence, to turn it into a stage, to deliver a line that would not only stop the chuckles but engrave itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it, because Jasmine Crockett was not just another politician in that room. She was the culmination of a journey built on fire. She was about to show exactly why she had never been one to bow before arrogance. The room thought it had seen the peak of the moment. They had not. The storm was only beginning to break. The silence after Breyer's laugh did not last long. The air was charged, restless, heavy with expectation. Crockett leaned forward, her voice measured at first, each word deliberate, almost calm. She acknowledged his point not in submission, but in precision. The way a fighter sizes up an opponent before the real blows begin. Breyer responded with a smirk, his tone dripping with a mixture of condescension and mock amusement. To him, this was nothing more than another debate he had already won. But something was shifting. The rhythm of the exchange began to tilt. For every polished dismissal, Breyer tossed out, Crockett countered with clarity. For every laugh meant to soften the blow of his authority, she replied with truths that landed harder than he anticipated. The crowd felt it, the pendulum swinging, the tension tightening. Breyer leaned back, using the gravity of his stature, throwing in anecdotes from his long career. each one meant to remind the room that he had been there, had ruled, had written. The history books. He thought his stories would charm, would dominate. Yet with each attempt, the gap widened. The people in the gallery began to sense it. They shifted in their seats, whispering, caught between the instinct to respect the elder statesman and the growing realization that his authority no longer carried the same untouchable weight. Crockett's tone sharpened. Still calm, still controlled, but unmistakably rising in force. She wasn't attacking. She was dismantling. Every time Breyer tried to paint her as inexperienced, she reframed it as perspective. Every time he implied her arguments lacked depth, she wielded her own experience, her time in the courts, her battles in Congress, her lived reality as a woman of color in America. Each word she spoke began to chip away at the marble pedestal Breyer thought he still stood on. The escalation was not volume. It was gravity. The room, which had erupted in laughter minutes earlier, was now quieting. The chuckles faded into nervous coughs, the smirks into furrowed brows. Even Breyer, still forcing the grin, began to blink a little faster, his hands tightening against the armrests of his chair. This was no longer a sparring match. It was a collision of eras. The old guard, comfortable in the habits of dismissal, meeting the new guard armed with a sharper fire, unwilling to let laughter dictate the terms of respect. And yet, no one in that room could have predicted how quickly the pendulum would swing next. For as strong as Crockett's rising words were, they were building toward something greater. Every pause, every carefully chosen phrase was a prelude. She was not finished. She was loading her silence with dynamite. The laughter had evaporated, but the tension now pressed against every chest in the chamber. The escalation was complete. The air felt like glass, seconds from shattering. And then came the moment. The question hung in the air, Breyer's smirk daring her to stumble. Crockett inhaled, straightened her posture, and prepared to deliver the line that would cut through the arrogance, leave the court colder than stone. What she said next would turn that heavy silence into a historic freeze. The room seemed to stop breathing as Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, the weight of the moment balanced on the edge of her tongue. Breyer's smirk still lingered, stretched thin across his face like a mask of confidence he didn't yet realize was cracking. He had laughed, the crowd had joined, but now the sound had died, replaced by a silence so sharp it cut, and into that silence, Crockett spoke. Her voice did not rise in anger. It didn't need to. It dropped lower, steadier, each syllable deliberate. She began by acknowledging the laughter, almost graciously. It's funny, isn't it, how quickly people laugh when they don't have to live the reality they're dismissing. The words fell heavy, not as a retort, but as a mirror held up to the room. Heads tilted, smiles faltered. Breyer's own expression stiffened. She didn't look at him when she said it. She looked past him, through him, as if addressing not just the man in the chair, but the entire tradition of voices that had laughed before. Her calmness was unnerving, the kind of composure that reveals strength rather than weakness. And then she pressed further. I respect the years you've given to this country, Judge. I truly do. But respect for service doesn't mean silence in the face of dismissal. Because if the only thing we inherit from experience is arrogance, then what was the point of all those years? The gasp from the gallery was audible. A line had been crossed not by insult, but by truth, plain and raw. Breyer blinked, his smirk faltering into something tighter, thinner. His hand shifted slightly on the armrest, a tell the cameras would not miss. Crockett wasn't finished. She let the silence stretch, her eyes finally locking with his. You laugh at me, Judge, but I didn't come here to be laughed at. I came here to remind this room that justice doesn't belong to the comfortable. Justice belongs to those who need it most. The words landed like a gavel. The silence deepened, pulling the audience into her gravity. Breyer opened his mouth as if to respond, but Crockett was already moving, her voice rising, not in volume, but in conviction. She told the story of constituents who had been laughed at when they spoke up about injustice, of clients who had walked into courtrooms with everything on the line and left with nothing but scorn. She wove their struggles into the fabric of her response. making it clear that Breyer's laugh was not about her alone. It was about every person who had ever been dismissed for daring to speak truth. And then came the line. The one that turned the room ice cold. "You can laugh at me, Judge Breyer. You can smirk and chuckle and lean back like the weight of you untouchable. But when history looks back, it won't remember the laugh. It will remember the silence that followed when truth walked into the room." The chamber froze. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the scratch of the stenographer's keys. The air seemed suspended, as though time itself refused to move forward until the weight of her words had been absorbed. Breyer's eyes narrowed, but his lips no longer dared to curl. He sat forward now, shoulders stiff, the easy amusement gone. Crockett's composure had flipped the room. Where laughter had filled it minutes before, now only a remained. The audience felt it too. This was not the outburst of a politician seeking attention. This was a controlled demolition of arrogance executed with precision. Every pause had been a hammer strike. Every word a chisel breaking away the marble facade of untouchable authority. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile or seek validation. She simply let the silence hold, let the weight of what she had said linger in the air. Because she knew she didn't need to add anything more. She had already won the room. But outside those walls, the moment had already begun to ripple. Phones buzzed in laps, texts flew, tweets drafted themselves in real time. The phrase "it won't remember," the laugh began to spread like wildfire. Hashtags formed, hashtag ice cold, hashtag truth over laughter, hashtag Crockett freeze. Clips would surface within minutes, dissected, celebrated, debated. But none of that had reached the room yet. Inside, there was only silence. And in that silence, the power dynamic had shifted. The old guard, for once, had been rendered speechless. Breyer shifted again, finally attempting to recover, but his laugh was gone. His rebuttal, whatever it was, would now sound defensive, diminished, overshadowed. The moment belonged to Crockett. To the voice that refused to be reduced, the narrator's voice returned. A thread of tension weaving through. The courtroom had erupted in laughter. Now it sat frozen in silence. But beyond these walls, the shock waves were only beginning. The silence cracked not with laughter, not with dismissal, but with the sound of history turning. And as the audience would soon discover, the aftershocks of this one exchange would ripple far beyond the chamber, shaking politics, media, and the nation itself. The silence inside the chamber lasted only a breath. But outside, the explosion had already begun. The moment Jasmine Crockett's words left her lips, they leaped from the courtroom into the bloodstream of the internet, carried by those who knew history had just been made. Clips surfaced within minutes, grainy phone recordings from the gallery, journalists' live tweets, captions stamped in bold. "You can laugh at me, Judge, but history won't remember the laugh." Twitter caught fire. Within an hour, hashtag ice cold was trending nationally, followed closely by hashtag truth over laughter. Memes flooded timelines, Breyer's smirk frozen beside Crockett's unflinching stare. TikTok stitched her line into montages of marches, protests, and the faces of those who had been dismissed but endured. Instagram Reels looped the moment again and again, replay sharpening the chill that had gripped the chamber. For her supporters, it was vindication. Commentators called it the line of the year. Late-night hosts replayed the clip with awe instead of jokes. Progressive circles saw in her words not just a clapback, but a declaration, a reminder that arrogance, no matter how polished, could still be broken. One viral post read, "Breyer's laugh was the old America. Crockett's silence was the new America." The balance just shifted. But it wasn't only celebration. Critics scrambled to spin the moment. Pundits on cable news attempted damage control, calling her words disrespectful or theatrical. Yet even their critiques carried a nervous edge, because deep down, they knew what the public had already decided. Crockett had seized the moment, and Breyer had lost it. The ripple effect reached beyond the media. Politicians weighed in. Young lawmakers praised her composure and courage, framing her as the future of democratic leadership. Civil rights groups amplified her words, connecting them to the broader struggle against systemic dismissal. Even those who had never heard of her before that day now knew her name. She wasn't just a participant in the exchange anymore. She was its author, its victor, the figure history would remember. Meanwhile, Breyer himself became a meme, his once dignified laugh reduced to a symbol of arrogance caught in the act of crumbling. Commentators noted the irony. A man who had spent decades crafting careful words, done in seconds by a laugh, and for everyday people watching from their homes, offices, and phones, the impact was personal. They saw themselves in Crockett's silence, in her refusal to bow, in the calm ferocity of her words. Teachers shared the clip with their students as an example of speaking truth to power. Parents sent it to their children with notes like, "Never let anyone laugh you out of your own dignity." Workers replayed it on breaks, whispering, "That's exactly how I felt when they dismissed me." What Crockett had done in that chamber was more than respond to a laugh. She had transformed it into a rallying cry. The ice she had cast over the courtroom spread outward, chilling those who had grown too comfortable in their superiority and warming those who longed for someone to stand tall on their behalf. The narrator's voice cut through the montage of reaction. It began as a laugh in one room, but by nightfall, it had become a movement across the nation. And the question lingered, what would happen when the old guard realized the world was no longer laughing with them? The shock waves had only begun. Country braced for the next ripple, the deeper reckoning, and all of it led back to a single line. In the days that followed, the clip of Judge Breyer's laugh and Jasmine Crockett's ice-cold reply became more than just political theater. It became a parable. Commentators stopped asking what had been said and began asking what it meant. The exchange was replayed not only for its drama, but for the deeper truth it revealed about power, dignity, and the courage to confront them both. For Crockett's supporters, the moment was proof that arrogance will always be vulnerable when faced with integrity. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't broken down, she hadn't begged for respect. She had stood in silence until it was her turn, and then, with a single line, shifted the room's temperature. That was the lesson. Dignity doesn't need to scream. It only needs to speak once, at the right time, with the right weight. Her words carried beyond politics. Immigrant families saw in her stance the reflection of their own struggles, moments when their accents had been mocked, then their achievements had been doubted, when their presence in America had been treated as temporary. Her calm defiance became a beacon, a reminder that belonging is not granted by laughter from the powerful, but by the truth carried in one's voice. Civil rights leaders framed the moment as generational.
Ow.
Breyer represents the laugh of the past, one said. Crockett represents the future that will not be dismissed. A young activist clipped her line into protest chants. College students began quoting her in speeches. The moral lesson spread. In a world quick to humiliate, true strength lies in refusing to be humiliated. And yet, what made her stand resonate was not just the rebuttal, it was the refusal to dehumanize in return. She didn't mirror his arrogance. She didn't reduce herself to his level. Instead, she lifted the exchange to a higher ground. In doing so, she gave permission for others to believe that their own truth, calmly spoken, could carry the same power. The narrator's voice sharpened. The reflection, every movement is born from a moment when someone refuses to laugh along. Jasmine Crockett's silence, followed by her truth, was not just about her. It was about every person who has been laughed at, underestimated, or dismissed. It was a reminder that justice begins not in the roar of a crowd, but in the stillness of one voice choosing dignity over despair. The lesson rang simple, yet universal. Arrogance may win applause, but it never wins history. Dignity, spoken clearly, always outlasts the smirk. And as the nation absorbed that truth, a new question hovered in the air. If one woman's line could silence a courtroom and awaken a country, what would happen when millions chose to speak? With the same courage? The stage was set for something larger than one clash. The audience leaned in, knowing the story was not over. The story of Judge Breyer's laugh and Jasmine Crockett's reply wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a reminder of who we are, who we refuse to be. That smirk, that laugh, represented Centuries of dismissal of power mocking those who dared to speak. But Crockett's line, steady, sharp, unflinching, reminded us all that dignity has the final word. This isn't about one judge or one congresswoman. It's about every immigrant who's been told they don't belong, every worker who's been mocked for their accent, every young leader who's been laughed at for daring to stand tall. Crockett's moment in that courtroom proved something. Timeless. The voices of the underestimated are rising, and when they speak, the world listens. And now it's our turn. If you felt that shiver when the room went cold, if you recognized your own story in her silence and her strength, then don't just watch this moment. Be part of it. Share it. Talk about it. Let it remind you that dignity belongs to you, no matter who tries to laugh it away, because arrogance fades. Power shifts. But the courage to speak truth, calmly and fearlessly, is what changes history. And tonight, you've seen it happen. So if you believe that laughter from the powerful should never drown out the voices of the brave, if you believe that America is stronger when every story is heard, then make sure this message doesn't stop here. Subscribe, share, add your voice, because the story isn't finished.